the trees along the Yalu River had started to turn yellow. It was late October 1950, and the first frost was creeping across the mountains of northern Korea. American and UN forces, riding the momentum of successive victories, had advanced deep into the north. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Far East, stood exultant. The mission had evolved. This wasn't merely about repelling the North Korean invasion. It was about unifying the peninsula on American terms. Behind him, Seoul had been retaken. The unexpected amphibious landing at Incheon had shifted the war dramatically. His troops had shattered the North Korean People's Army and crossed the 38th parallel despite international warnings. Now they neared the Yalu River, the frontier between North Korea and China. But from Beijing came the storm clouds. For weeks, Chinese officials had issued warnings: do not approach the Yalu. This is our boundary. On October 1, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai personally cautioned India's ambassador. If American forces crossed the 38th parallel and threatened the border, China would intervene. MacArthur dismissed these threats. To him, they were psychological tactics, not actual policy. He believed China, still recovering from its own civil war, lacked either the means or the will to act. Yet intelligence reports pouring into his Tokyo HQ suggested otherwise: troop movements across Manchuria, radio silence from Chinese units, unusual disappearances along mountain trails. MacArthur was not merely confident, he was defiant. On October 20, UN forces captured Pyongyang. 2 days later, MacArthur ordered a full advance toward the Yalu, ignoring direct cautions from the Joint Chiefs and even President Truman's advisors. He spoke of victory by Christmas and told the press the war was almost over. A week later, on Wake Island, he assured Truman himself, the Chinese will not intervene. What MacArthur didn't know, or chose to disregard, was that on that very day, Chinese volunteer forces were already crossing the Yalu under cover of darkness. Tens of thousands of battle-hardened soldiers moved silently through rugged terrain, using natural cover and night marches to evade detection. Their orders were clear: destroy the advancing UN spearheads, reclaim North Korea, and punish American overreach. And they would. By late November, the tide would shift in one of the most devastating ambushes of modern warfare. But in October, one man saw the looming danger and acted with caution: President Truman. While MacArthur pushed for total victory, Truman studied the intelligence with growing concern. He didn't just see troop numbers, he saw the potential for a second war against China, perhaps even the Soviet Union, lurking in the fog. This was no longer just about Korea. It was a test of post-war world order. That's the simplified narrative often repeated. MacArthur was dismissed because he mishandled the Korean War, overreached, and was blindsided by Chinese intervention. But that's not why Truman removed him. MacArthur was not relieved due to tactical missteps, he was dismissed for something far more dangerous: insubordination, strategic defiance, and a public campaign that undercut American foreign policy, pushing the globe perilously close to nuclear conflict. The reality is more unsettling and far-reaching. MacArthur was a war hero, a titan of World War II, and a living symbol of American power. But in 1950, he wasn't just fighting North Korea, he was openly challenging his president's policy. That policy was unambiguous: contain the conflict, avoid escalation, and prevent another world war. After World War II, Truman and his advisors had drawn a red line not across rivers or borders, but around the very idea of total war. The U.S. would counter communist expansion, yes, but only through limited engagements, defined objectives, restrained force, no nuclear weapons, no invasion of China, and absolutely no direct conflict with the Soviet Union. MacArthur loudly disagreed. As Chinese forces surged across the Yalu and reversed the UN advance, he lobbied Washington for expanded authority, strikes against Chinese bases, the potential use of 34 nuclear weapons, a naval blockade, and the deployment of Chiang Kai-shek's troops from Taiwan. When Truman refused, MacArthur didn't retreat. He gave speeches, released statements to the press, and sent private letters to Congress leaked deliberately, accusing the administration of appeasement, weakness, and betrayal of victory. It wasn't merely dissent, it was political warfare against his commander-in-chief. By spring 1951, Truman had enough. He would not be intimidated by a general, even America's most celebrated one. He grasped the stakes. If military leaders dictated foreign policy, if a battlefield commander could openly defy the president, the foundations of American democracy were at risk. Korea had become secondary. The primary issue was constitutional authority, civilian control over the military, and the balance between elected leadership and military command. So Truman acted. On April 11, 1951, Douglas MacArthur was relieved of command. The reaction was immediate. Public support for MacArthur surged, congressional hearings erupted, and Truman was branded a traitor, coward, and failure. Yet he stood firm. He hadn't removed MacArthur because of lost battles, he removed him to preserve civilian supremacy. To understand the confrontation between Truman and MacArthur, we must rewind to the end of World War II. MacArthur was no ordinary officer. By 1945, he was a household name, the man who promised, "I shall return," and delivered, the architect of victory in the Pacific. His image was etched in marble: godlike authority, military genius, American hero. After Japan's surrender, he was appointed supreme commander for the Allied powers in Japan. From Tokyo, he didn't merely oversee occupation. He ran post-war Japan like a personal thief, issuing orders, restructuring society, writing Japan's constitution. No American general held more power over a foreign country since the days of Caesar. Meanwhile, Truman had inherited a different kind of battlefield. Sworn in after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, he stepped into a world reeling from war and nuclear aftermath. He didn't have MacArthur's battlefield prestige, but he had something else: authority, and a growing sense that America's next war wouldn't be conventional. That war arrived in June 1950. On June 25, North Korean forces launched a full-scale invasion across the 38th parallel, overwhelming South Korean defenses and pushing towards Seoul. Truman acted fast. He secured a UN resolution for collective defense. American troops were deployed within days. It was the first true test of the post-war world order and a chance to stop communism spread by force. MacArthur was handed command of UN forces. And at first he delivered. His daring in Chan landing in September 1950 was a masterstroke. An amphibious surprise attack that broke North Korean supply lines and forced a retreat. Seoul was liberated. US and UN troops pushed north with incredible speed. That's when the mission changed. At first, the war's goal was clear: push North Korea back across the 38th parallel and restore the status quo. But with the North in retreat and communist lines collapsing, MacArthur and many in Washington began to dream of total victory. Why stop at the 38th? Why not unite Korea under a pro-Western government? MacArthur advanced. Despite Chinese warnings, despite Truman's hesitation. By mid-October, UN forces had crossed deep into the north. Pyongyang fell and American troops pushed toward the Yalu River, the border with China. The question wasn't just military anymore. It was geopolitical. Because if China entered the war and the Soviets followed, the Korean peninsula would become the fuse for global ignition. Truman knew this. He had already used atomic bombs once. He understood escalation better than anyone. And he knew MacArthur wasn't just charging toward victory. He was charging toward a world war. The Korean War's opening months felt like a pendulum swinging between extremes. North Korea stormed south in June. MacArthur's Incheon landing flipped the war by September. But as UN troops pushed north toward the Yalu River, the momentum carried a heavy price and revealed a terrifying new reality. This was no longer just a Korean war. It was a war shadowed by Chinese armies, Soviet strategies, and the threat of nuclear escalation. In early October 1950, U.S. intelligence began receiving intercepted messages and refugee accounts suggesting mass Chinese troop movements near the Yalu Satellite reconnaissance didn't exist. Only field reports, aerial photos, and captured prisoners. One after another, they repeated the same thing. The Chinese were coming. Estimates varied. But MacArthur's command dismissed the threat. The dominant belief was that China might send 30,000, 50,000 volunteers at most. Poorly equipped and easily repelled. In truth, they sent 300,000 men from the People's Volunteer Army under General Pingde. They moved under cover of night using mountainous terrain to conceal mass deployment. The U.S. military was caught flat-footed. In late November, Chinese forces launched the first phase offensive, a sudden strike that shredded UN positions across the northeast. American and South Korean troops were forced into a brutal winter retreat, facing ambushes, encirclements, and freezing temperatures in the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. 30,000 UN troops were surrounded by 120,000 Chinese, enduring horrific losses to break out. It was clear now China had committed. The war had escalated. That's when MacArthur proposed something extraordinary. In a classified communication to the Joint Chiefs, he suggested using atomic bombs, not just one or two, but as many as 34 nuclear weapons targeted across key Chinese supply hubs and staging areas in Manchuria. He also requested authorization to bomb Chinese territory, mine harbors, and bring Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces from Taiwan into the conflict. The logic was brutal. Break China's will to fight through overwhelming force. Truman's response, absolute refusal. He and his advisors, including Secretary of State Dean Ayrton and Defense Secretary George Marshall, saw the broader picture. Bombing China might trigger direct Soviet involvement. Under the terms of the Sino-Soviet alliance, the USSR could treat an American attack on China as an act of war. And with both superpowers holding nuclear capability, or soon acquiring it, that meant global annihilation was on the table. Worse, European allies were balking. Britain, France, and others warned that widening the war would fracture the Western alliance. Truman knew the strategic math. One general's thirst for escalation could unravel everything. The casualty numbers told their own story. By spring 1951, U.S. forces had already suffered over 50,000 casualties. South Korean losses were far higher. Chinese casualties were staggering, but the manpower seemed endless. And MacArthur's vision didn't offer an end. It offered a cliff. The Truman administration wasn't fighting just for territory anymore. It was fighting for limits, for control over how far war would go and how much destruction was acceptable in the nuclear age. And MacArthur was pushing those limits to the edge. The ground crunched beneath American boots as columns of UN forces advanced into North Korea's highlands. October 1950 marked the height of General MacArthur's confidence. His forces had just seized Pyongyang with minimal resistance. Enemy units scattered. Reports of North Korean collapse multiplied. The war looked nearly over. MacArthur smelled final victory, and he wanted it on his terms. Ignoring warnings from Beijing, bypassing cautious advice from Washington, he ordered a two-pronged offensive toward the Yalu River. In the west, U.S. 8th Army pushed north from Pyongyang. In the east, SCOR advanced toward the Chosin Reservoir, deep into rugged, frozen mountain terrain. The message was clear. End the war. Reunify Korea and plant the American flag at China's doorstep. But the trap was already set. Unbeknownst to MacArthur, General Ping Dehi's People's Volunteer Army had already crossed into North Korea. Using darkness, mountain passes, and radio silence, they inserted over 180,000 troops into key positions along the front. Their orders were simple: lure the enemy in, then strike. As the UN forces marched north, they met silence. Villages were empty, roads were clear. Air reconnaissance spotted few enemies. It felt too easy. It was. On October 25, the Chinese launched their first ambush in the west. They struck with ferocity using bugles, night assaults, and human wave attacks that stunned US and South Korean units. But then they withdrew just as quickly, disappearing into the mountains. MacArthur interpreted it as a desperate show, a sign that China had no stomach for full commitment. He pushed forward. Then came the hammer. On November 27, near the Shosan Reservoir, X-Corps was encircled by over 120,000 Chinese troops. The temperature plunged below 30 degrees. Equipment froze. Wounded soldiers died of exposure. Supply lines snapped. Under pressure. It became one of the most brutal battles in American military history. For 17 days, Marines and Army units fought their way out in what became known as the Frozen Chosen Retreat. They inflicted massive casualties on the Chinese, an estimated 50,000, but the cost was staggering. Nearly 17,000 UN casualties and a complete strategic withdrawal southward. Across the front, MacArthur's advance crumbled. UN forces were in full retreat, abandoning territory they had just taken. By Christmas, the war's tide had reversed entirely. Seoul would fall. Again. The dream of a unified Korea lay buried beneath snow and blood. MacArthur downplayed the disaster. He blamed Washington's restrictions. He blamed Allied hesitation. But the truth was unavoidable. He had walked into a trap because he refused to believe his enemies could set one. Truman, meanwhile, watched with growing dread. The Chinese weren't bluffing. The Soviets were watching. The war wasn't ending. It was expanding. And the man leading it seemed determined to press even further. By early 1951, the Korean War had transformed into a strategic crisis. The math was brutal. MacArthur's advance had led to overextension. His underestimation of Chinese resolve had triggered full-scale intervention. And now his escalation proposals were threatening to turn a regional conflict into a global firestorm. At the heart of the crisis wasn't just a battlefield failure. It was a breakdown of policy coherence between the commander on the ground and the president in Washington. Truman's core doctrine, shaped in the aftermath of World War II, was simple but revolutionary. Wars must be limited. The United States would fight communism spread, but it would not risk a third world war to chase complete victory. MacArthur, by contrast, embraced the old-school total war mentality. If an enemy intervened, punish them. If China entered the war, strike Chinese territory. If troops crossed the Yalu, bomb the Yalu. His strategy had no containment, only dominance. That's where the collapse math began. If MacArthur bombed Chinese supply lines in Manchuria, Beijing would not stand alone. The Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, an alliance signed in February 1950, legally bound Moscow to come to China's defense. That meant potential war with the Soviet Union, who by 1951 was already on the cusp of nuclear capability. Truman's Joint Chiefs calculated the cost. If escalation occurred, U.S. forces in Europe would be vulnerable. NATO allies were not ready for a Soviet strike. The Marshall Plan's economic rebuilding could crumble. Japan's fragile democracy could be consumed in a regional meltdown. Worse, the American homeland would no longer be untouchable. The Soviets had tested their first atomic bomb in August 1949. Intelligence estimated they could soon deliver nuclear payloads via long-range bombers. For the first time, American cities were part of the war map, and MacArthur didn't seem to care. On March 20, 1951, MacArthur sent a letter to House Republican leader Joseph Martin, directly attacking Truman's policy of limited war. He declared, "There is no substitute for victory." The letter wasn't just political commentary. It was a constitutional challenge. And when it was leaked to the press, the damage was done. Civilian control was under siege. The American people were confused. Who spoke for U.S. foreign policy? The president or the general? Behind closed doors, Truman convened his inner circle. The Pentagon was split, but the National Security Council was unanimous. MacArthur's defiance could not continue. To allow a general to contradict elected leadership in public was to invite mutiny by rhetoric. Truman faced the hardest decision of his presidency. MacArthur was a national hero. A dismissal would spark outrage. But not acting would destroy the very principle of democracy he was fighting to protect. He issued the order. On April 11, 1951, the White House announced that General MacArthur had been relieved of all commands in the Far East. The backlash was immediate, but the war did not expand. The Chinese did not face atomic bombs. The Soviets did not mobilize. The collapse had been stopped just before the edge. October 15, 1950. Wake Island, a lonely speck in the Pacific Ocean, halfway between Hawaii and the Philippines, became the stage for a historic intense meeting between two men with wildly different worldviews, President Harry Truman and General Douglas MacArthur. Officially, the meeting was to review the progress of the Korean War. In reality, it was a test of trust, and it would confirm to Truman just how dangerously independent his top general had become. The setting was symbolic. Wake Island was chosen to save MacArthur the trip to Washington, as he hadn't left his Tokyo headquarters in over 5 years. Truman traveled farther to meet him than any sitting U.S. president had traveled to meet a military commander, and MacArthur's attitude reflected that imbalance. From the moment they met, the tone was off. MacArthur arrived late. He offered a casual handshake. No salute, no deference. As Truman biographer David McCulloch noted, MacArthur acted less like a subordinate and more like a sovereign. But it wasn't just style. It was substance. Truman came armed with questions. How serious was the Chinese threat? What were the odds of intervention? Could the war be won without drawing in China? MacArthur's answers were unequivocal and tragically wrong. He assured Truman there was very little chance of Chinese intervention. He dismissed intelligence reports as exaggerated. He argued the North Korean army was finished and that the war could be over by Thanksgiving. He presented an image of absolute control. Truman left Wake Island uneasy. He had respected MacArthur's military brilliance, but now he saw something else. Blind confidence, strategic recklessness, and a general convinced he was untouchable. Worse, MacArthur showed no interest in aligning with the administration's broader geopolitical objectives. This wasn't just about Korea anymore. Truman had broader concerns. The security of Europe, NATO cohesion, Soviet containment. The Korean War was a brush fire in a forest of dry kindling. The wrong spark could ignite something far worse. Truman wanted to send a message of restraint. MacArthur wanted to send a message of strength regardless of the global consequences. The Wake Island meeting revealed a chasm that could not be bridged. 3 days later, Chinese troops began entering Korea en masse. By November, the war had reversed. American troops were in retreat. Seoul would fall again in January. And the confidence MacArthur had displayed in that island briefing room looked less like strategy and more like hubris. Truman had seen it coming, and now he knew the war couldn't be fought on two fronts, one in Korea and one in Washington. If MacArthur wouldn't follow orders, he would have to go. Wake Island was no mere photo op. It was the turning point before the rupture. By the spring of 1951, the Korean battlefield had stabilized. But in Washington, a political explosion was building. MacArthur, frustrated by restrictions placed on his command, was no longer just lobbying behind closed doors. He had begun openly defying President Truman's limited war policy. And the moment he put those defiant words into writing, the conflict between General and Commander-in-Chief became irreversible. The spark came in March 1951 when MacArthur wrote a letter to House Minority Leader Joseph Martin, a Republican critic of Truman's war strategy. The general's words were scathing. He attacked the administration's appeasement, declared that fighting a limited war was a betrayal of U.S. troops, and famously wrote, "There is no substitute for victory." The letter wasn't private for long. Within days, Martin read it aloud on the House floor. Newspapers splashed the quotes across front pages. It looked like a call to arms, MacArthur accusing the president of weakness and hinting he would win the war if only Truman would get out of the way. It wasn't just insubordination. It was a political torpedo aimed directly at the White House. Truman was furious, but not surprised. For months, he had received intelligence reports and leaked briefings showing MacArthur's growing campaign against administration policy. The Wake Island meeting had revealed the general's contempt. The fallout from the chosen reservoir retreat had only hardened positions. But now MacArthur had made his rebellion public. The U.S. Boy Constitution is clear. The military answers to civilian leadership. In wartime, presidents have dismissed generals before, but never one so popular, so decorated, so mythologized. Truman weighed the risks. Public support for MacArthur remained strong. His popularity soared after the letter's release. Conservative politicians rallied behind him. Some even whispered that he could run for president in 1952. But Truman saw something deeper. The survival of American democratic norms was on the line. If a general could publicly contradict the president and survive in command, what precedent would that set? What would future generals believe they could get away with? Truman wasn't just defending policy. He was defending the principle of civilian control over the military, the very backbone of constitutional governance. On April 5, Truman met with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Their verdict was mixed. Some feared backlash. Others believed MacArthur's military judgment had failed. But the consensus was that the damage to unity and chain of command was severe. 6 days later, on April 11, 1951, President Truman announced MacArthur's dismissal. The message was short, official, and firm. General of the Army Douglas MacArthur is being relieved of his commands. The public reaction was explosive. Truman's approval rating plummeted. Protests erupted. Congress held weeks of hearings. MacArthur returned to the U.S. to a hero's welcome and delivered a historic address to Congress, ending with the line, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." But MacArthur didn't fade away quietly. And Truman didn't flinch. He had removed the most powerful general in the world because no war, no matter how righteous, could be allowed to override the Constitution. April 1951 was not just the end of a military command. It was the reaffirmation of a democratic principle that would echo through every American war that followed. Truman's decision to remove MacArthur wasn't about a single disagreement. It was about the dangerous precedent being set by a general who had publicly challenged the authority of the president during a time of war. MacArthur had won stunning victories and embodied American military power. But Truman understood something MacArthur didn't or wouldn't acknowledge. That wars in the nuclear age had to be restrained, not won at any cost. In MacArthur's vision, the path forward was clear. Expand the war into China. Destroy supply lines in Manchuria, potentially use nuclear weapons if necessary. Victory above all. In Truman's eyes, that path wasn't just reckless, it was catastrophic. The stakes weren't only on the battlefield. A widened war could have drawn in the Soviet Union. The result, not just World War II, but the end of civilization as they knew it. And Truman, who had authorized the atomic bomb in 1945, understood its power better than anyone alive. Civilian control over the military had to be protected, not only to preserve the Constitution, but to ensure that no single individual, no matter how decorated, could drag the nation into a war it didn't choose. In the weeks that followed MacArthur's firing, public opinion surged in favor of the general. But behind the scenes, Truman's quiet decision began to prove itself right. The Korean War, while brutal and costly, remained confined. No atomic bombs were dropped. China did not face full-scale invasion. The Soviet Union did not engage militarily. NATO held firm. Europe remained stable. MacArthur's dismissal reaffirmed the limits of military power in a democracy and set the tone for future conflicts. Presidents would now understand that commanding the armed forces came with strategic caution, not just battlefield audacity. Generals, however brilliant, would understand their role within a system. Not above it. When asked years later about his choice, Truman didn't flinch. "I relieved him," he said, "because he refused to honor the authority of the president. I didn't dismiss him because he was an incompetent fool, though he often was." It was frank. It was personal. But it was also the reality. Ultimately, Truman's action wasn't merely about a single general. It was about preserving a republic from its own dangerous myths. Imagine an alternate 1951. Instead of being removed, General Douglas MacArthur receives his demands: full control to escalate the Korean War into China. The Yalu River is bombarded. Chinese strongholds in Manchuria are targeted. Nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan are deployed. And then, as the People's Liberation Army counterattacks, MacArthur plays his ultimate hand, unleashing atomic bombs across Northeast Asia. The outcome, a scorched earth catastrophe. Millions of Chinese casualties. Soviet retaliation, perhaps not nuclear, but with massive conventional forces in Europe. The Cold War turns into a hot conflict. Korea becomes the flashpoint that devastates Tokyo, London, and possibly New York. That wasn't fantasy. That was the peril. And that's why Truman intervened. MacArthur's removal wasn't merely a domestic political maneuver. It was the safeguard between a limited conflict and total devastation, between a single peninsula aflame and a hemisphere at war. That moment, April 11, 1951, demonstrated that American democracy could self-correct, that generals, no matter how revered, were subordinate to the Constitution, and that a president could make the most unpopular decision in the nation's history and ultimately be vindicated by history itself. While MacArthur faded into political obscurity, the world remained whole. The Cold War remained cold. NATO endured. South Korea survived. And Truman, underestimated to the very end, quietly set the parameters of power in the nuclear age.